Rain lashed against cracked glass when a dying Harley's roar shattered the midnight silence. A terrifying figure stepped out of the storm, a Hell's Angel, stranded, furious, and desperate. Martha had exactly $10 to her name. Giving it away was financial suicide. She did it anyway. The wind howling across Nevada's Highway 50, often called the loneliest road in America, felt like it was trying to peel the asphalt straight off the desert floor. It was a miserable, bone-chilling November night, and 62-year-old Martha Hayes was running on fumes, both literally and metaphorically. Sitting in her rusted 1998 Ford Taurus, beneath the flickering fluorescent canopy of a lonely Chevron station, Martha stared at the single, crumpled $10 bill in her trembling hand. It was her entire net worth. 8 months ago, her husband, David, had passed away after a brutal, agonizing fight with pancreatic cancer. The medical bills had devoured their savings, their retirement, and finally, their peace of mind. The life insurance company had found a cruel loophole, leaving Martha with nothing but a mountain of debt and a foreclosure notice. On Monday morning, the bank was coming for her house. This $10 bill was supposed to buy her a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and just enough gas to get her to her sister's house 2 towns over so she wouldn't have to sleep in her car. She took a deep, shaky breath, zipped up her threadbare wool coat, and opened the car door, preparing to go inside to pay the cashier. But as her boots hit the wet pavement, a deafening, sputtering roar tore through the stormy night. A massive custom Harley-Davidson panhead limped into the gas station, its engine coughing violently before dying completely right next to the pump. The man who dismounted was a mountain of leather, denim, and muscle. He wore a soaked leather vest, and even in the dim, flickering light, Martha could clearly see the legendary insignia plastered across his back, the winged death's head. Above it, the top rocker read, Hell's Angels, and the bottom rocker proudly declared, Oakland. This was no weekend rider. This was a fully patched member of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world. Martha watched from behind the safety of her car door as the biker started tearing through his saddlebags, cursing loudly. He was soaked to the bone, his thick beard dripping with freezing rain, a deep scar cutting across his left cheek. His name was Tommy Reynolds, known on the streets as Wrench, a veteran of the club who had ridden alongside the legendary Sonny Barger. But tonight, Wrench wasn't an intimidating outlaw. He was a desperate man. Wrench stormed into the brightly lit convenience store. Martha, clutching her $10 bill, quietly followed him inside, instinctively keeping her distance. Behind the counter, a pale, terrified teenager named Kevin was physically shaking as the massive Hell's Angel slammed a heavy, grease-stained hand onto the glass counter. "I lost my damn wallet somewhere near Eli," Wrench barked, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "My fuel line is busted, my phone is dead, and I need a patch kit and a gallon of gas. I'll mail you $100 tomorrow. Just let me use the phone and give me the kit." Kevin backed up against the cigarette display, his eyes darting to the death's head on Wrench's chest. I can't do that, sir. Store policy. If you don't have money, I have to ask you to leave, or I have to call the police." Wrench's eyes darkened, the veins in his thick neck bulging. "I don't have time for the cops, kid. I'm trying to get to a hospital in Reno. My brother is on life support. If I don't get back on that highway right now, I'm not going to get to say goodbye. Just give me the damn patch kit." Kevin grabbed the store phone, his hands sweating. "Get out! I'm calling the sheriff." The tension in the tiny store reached a boiling point. Wrench looked like he was about to rip the plexiglass counter clean off its hinges. The desperation of a man about to lose his family was radiating off him, mixing with the dangerous volatility of his lifestyle. "Excuse me." A soft, trembling voice cut through the heavy air. Wrench whipped around, his fists clenched, expecting a threat. Instead, he found a frail, grey-haired woman standing 3 feet away. Martha stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out her thin, wrinkled hand and placed her crumpled $10 bill on the glass counter. "Put his patch kit and his gas on this," Martha said, her voice finding its strength. She looked at the terrified teenager. "And put the phone down, Kevin." Wrench stared at her, completely stunned. The fury drained from his face, replaced by absolute bewilderment. He looked at the $10 bill, then down at Martha's scuffed, taped-up shoes and her worn-out coat. It didn't take a genius to see that this woman had nothing to spare. "Lady," Wrench said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its aggressive edge. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you see this patch? People lock their doors when I ride by. You shouldn't be paying for my gas." Martha met his intense, dark gaze without blinking. "I don't care what's on your back, Mr. Reynolds," she said, glancing at the name stitched on the front of his cut. "My husband, David, rode a motorcycle. He was a good man. If he were stranded in the freezing rain, trying to get to someone he loved, I would pray that a stranger would help him. So take the kit. Fix your bike. Go say goodbye to your brother." Wrench stood frozen. For a man who lived his entire life by the harsh codes of the streets, this pure, uncalculated act of grace was entirely alien. He slowly reached out and took the patch kit Kevin silently pushed across the counter. "I need your address," Wrench said firmly. "I pay my debts. I'll have $100 to you by Tuesday." Martha smiled sadly, shaking her head. "I won't be at my address on Tuesday. The bank is taking my house on Monday morning. Just consider it a gift. Ride safe." Before Wrench could argue, Martha turned and walked out of the store into the freezing rain. She climbed into her cold Ford Taurus, her stomach growling violently. She had no money for food, no money for gas. She would have to sleep in the freezing car tonight, right here in the parking lot. But as she watched the massive Hell's Angel fix his bike, fire up the deafening engine, and speed off toward Reno, a profound sense of peace washed over her. She had lost everything, but she hadn't lost her humanity. Sunday morning dawned bleak and grey over Martha's small, peeling farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house was freezing. The utility company had shut off the heating fuel 2 days prior. She sat at her small kitchen table, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, nursing a mug of cold tap water. Surrounding her were cardboard boxes packed with 30 years of memories. David's old flannel shirts, framed photographs of their wedding, the faded quilt they had bought on their honeymoon in Montana. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., the sheriff would arrive with the bank representatives to change the locks. She had surrendered to her fate. The $10 she gave away Friday night meant she hadn't eaten anything but saltines for 2 days. But strangely, she didn't regret it. The memory of the desperation in that biker's eyes haunted her. She hoped he had made it to Reno in time. At 9:15 a.m., Martha noticed the water in her mug beginning to vibrate. Tiny ripples formed in the center of the cold water, vibrating outward to the ceramic edges. A low, baritone hum began to resonate through the wooden floorboards of her old house. At first, Martha thought it was a low-flying commercial jet, or perhaps an unseasonable roll of Nevada thunder. But the hum didn't fade. It grew louder and louder. The floorboards began to rattle. The framed picture of David, sitting on the mantelpiece, vibrated, inching dangerously close to the edge. The noise was no longer a hum. It was a guttural, mechanical roar that seemed to swallow the entire world. It sounded like an army of angry mechanical beasts descending upon her quiet, isolated street. Panic seized her chest. Martha stood up, dropping her blanket, and rushed to the front window. She pulled back the faded lace curtains and peered out, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in absolute terror and disbelief. Rolling down her narrow, dusty country road was a sea of chrome, black leather, and roaring V-twin engines. It wasn't 10 motorcycles. It wasn't 50. The procession stretched as far down the road as her eyes could see, a massive, tightly packed formation of heavy Harley-Davidsons. The noise was apocalyptic, vibrating deep within Martha's ribs. At the front of the pack, riding in a perfectly synchronized diamond formation, were massive men wearing the unmistakable leather cuts of the Hells Angels. The famous winged death's head was everywhere. They were flying colors from Oakland, from Vallejo, from San Jose, and from Reno. Martha watched, paralyzed, as the lead bikes signaled, breaking formation and turning directly into her gravel driveway. "Oh my God," Martha whispered, backing away from the window, her hands trembling. "What did I do? What did I do?" The motorcycles kept coming. They filled her small driveway. When the driveway was full, they parked on her dying front lawn, the heavy tires tearing up the frost-bitten grass. When the lawn was full, they parked along the shoulders of the road, lining both sides of the street for a quarter of a mile. More than 500 Hells Angels had descended upon her property. Across the street, Martha could see her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, frantically peeking through his blinds, a cordless phone pressed tight to his ear, undoubtedly screaming at the 911 dispatcher. Far down the road, Martha could see the flashing red and blue lights of 2 local police cruisers, but they were parked a half-mile away, forming a cautious blockade. They were entirely outnumbered and wildly outgunned. The police were not coming to help her. She was completely on her own. The deafening roar of the engines began to cut out, one by one, until an eerie, heavy silence fell over the yard, broken only by the sound of hot exhaust pipes ticking in the cold morning air. 500 hardened, heavily tattooed outlaw bikers dismounted in perfect, disciplined unison. They didn't shout. They didn't act unruly. They stood silently beside their bikes, forming a massive, intimidating wall of leather and steel around Martha's tiny home. Then the crowd parted. Walking up the center of the gravel driveway were 2 men. The first, Martha instantly recognized. It was Wrench. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, but he was no longer desperate. He walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man in his element. Beside him walked a man even larger, an absolute giant with silver hair tied in a bandana, wearing a patch that simply read, "President." Wrench was carrying something in his hands. It was a heavy, locked metal lockbox. Martha's heart hammered furiously. She didn't know whether to lock the door and hide, or face whatever this was head-on. Remembering her David and the courage he showed in his final days, she took a deep breath, unlocked her front door, and stepped out onto the creaking wooden porch. 500 pairs of eyes locked onto her simultaneously. The silence in the yard was absolute. Wrench stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at the frail widow standing bravely in her worn-out coat. "I told you I pay my debts, Martha," Wrench said, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent yard. But I didn't tell you the whole truth at that gas station. The giant president beside him stepped forward, pulling a heavy ring of brass keys from his pocket. He looked at Martha, his hardened face completely unreadable. "Ma'am," the president spoke, his voice booming like distant thunder. "Wrench didn't just make it to Reno. Because of your $10, he made it there with exactly 3 minutes to spare." The president's voice cracked slightly, betraying a sudden, shocking vulnerability. "The man on life support was my son. Wrench got to hold his hand right as he passed. You gave my boy his uncle in his final moments. And in this club, we don't just repay favors, we protect our own." The president inserted a brass key into the metal lockbox in Wrench's hands. With a heavy clack, the latch sprang open. What Martha saw inside the box made her knees buckle, setting the stage for a twist that would change her life and the entire town forever. Wrench held the heavy metal lockbox steady as Big Joe Callan, the president of the Reno Charter, turned the brass key. The mechanism disengaged with a sharp click that echoed across the dead silent yard. 500 hardened bikers stood completely motionless, their eyes fixed on the frail, shivering widow on the porch. Martha's breath plumed in the freezing morning air. She stepped forward, her knees trembling so violently she had to grip the wooden porch railing for support. She expected to see the $100 Wrench had promised her. Maybe, if they were feeling generous, a few hundred more to help her buy groceries. Instead, she looked down into the box and felt the world tilt on its axis. The lockbox was packed to the brim, meticulously organized, and divided into 3 distinct sections. Wrench tilted it forward so Martha could see clearly. Banded cash. On the left side sat tightly wrapped bricks of $100 bills. They were bound in standard bank straps, crisp and sequential. Legal documents. In the center was a thick manila folder, stamped with the logo of First Nevada Mutual, the exact bank that was foreclosing on her home tomorrow. The cut. On the right side, folded neatly, was a black leather riding vest. It wasn't patched with the Hells Angels logo, but it bore a custom embroidery on the breast pocket, in memory of David. I don't understand," Martha stammered, tears instantly pooling in her exhausted eyes. She looked from the terrifying mountain of a man holding the box to the tear-streaked face of the club president. "What is this?" Big Joe Callan stepped onto the first step of the porch, removing his sunglasses. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow from grief, yet fiercely, intensely focused. "When Wrench rolled into the hospital parking lot last night, my boy was fading fast," Joe said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "He got to the room, grabbed his nephew's hand, and 3 minutes later my son flatlined. If Wrench had been stuck on the side of Highway 50 for even 5 more minutes, my boy would have died without his favorite uncle. He would have died without his family complete." Joe paused, taking a deep breath to steady his massive chest. "When Wrench told us why he made it, that a widow with $10 to her name gave up her last dime so a patched outlaw could buy gas, the room went dead quiet. Word spread fast. First to the Oakland Charter, then Vallejo, then down to San Jose. By midnight, every patched member in a 300-mile radius knew what you did for this club." A man stepped out from the front row of the biker formation. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing denim or heavy leathers. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit beneath a heavy riding jacket. He carried a leather briefcase and adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Hayes," the man said smoothly, "my name is Richard Harrison. I am the legal counsel for the Hells Angels Motorcycle Corporation, Nevada Charters." Wrench mentioned that you were losing your home to the bank on Monday morning. In our world, we do not allow those who protect us to fall to the wolves." Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a gold pen. He pointed to the manila folder inside the lockbox. "At 2 a.m. this morning," Richard continued, "several associates and I paid a visit to the regional director of First Nevada Mutual at his private residence. We explained the situation to him. We strongly suggested that he open his branch office for a special one-time Sunday transaction. We pooled resources from 4 different charters to address your financial burdens." Richard pulled a laminated ledger sheet from his briefcase and handed it to Martha. "Financial settlement and debt clearance. Liability/debt. Account. Original amount owed. Paid by Hell's Angels. Remaining balance. Primary mortgage, First Nevada. $114,500. $114,500. $0. Late fees and penalties. $8,240. $8,240. $0. County property. Tax. Liens, $4,100. $4,100. $0. David's medical debt, collections. $32,000. $32,000. $0. Total resolved liabilities. $158,840. $158,840. $0. Martha stared at the table of numbers, her brain completely short-circuiting. The crushing, suffocating mountain of debt that had plagued her for 8 agonizing months, the debt that had taken her husband's dignity and her will to live, was simply gone. "The cash in the box is $40,000, Richard explained softly, tapping the banded stacks of bills. "That is for your retirement, your groceries, and your heating bill. Your home is now owned free and clear, Mrs. Hayes. The deed is in that folder." Martha collapsed. She hit the wooden deck of the porch, her hands covering her face, letting out a raw, guttural sob that tore through the freezing morning air. The weight of the world, a weight she had carried entirely alone since David died, was suddenly lifted by an army of 500 outlaws. Wrench immediately dropped to his knees, his massive, heavily tattooed arms gently helping the frail woman back to her feet. "You don't owe anyone anything anymore, Martha," Wrench whispered fiercely. "But the bank and the local sheriff are still scheduled to come out here tomorrow morning at 8 to lock you out. The banker we woke up wasn't exactly happy about the impromptu meeting. So if it's all right with you, my brothers and I are going to camp out on your lawn tonight, just to make sure the message is fully understood." Martha, weeping uncontrollably, could only nod, clutching the custom leather vest to her chest. Honor isn't found in a boardroom or a bank vault. Honor is found on the side of a freezing highway at midnight. When you give everything you have, you get everything you need. Big Joe Callan, president of Reno Hell's Angels. The local sheriff, a 20-year veteran named Boyd, hated Monday mornings. He hated them even more when his schedule included foreclosing on a beloved local widow. But the law was the law, and the bank had the paperwork. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Sheriff Boyd pulled his cruiser onto Martha's rural country road. Following closely behind him was a sleek silver Mercedes-Benz driven by Arthur Caldwell, the aggressive, notoriously ruthless collection manager for First Nevada Mutual. Caldwell had been briefed by the terrified regional director about the weekend's unorthodox transaction, but Caldwell was a skeptic. He believed the bikers had intimidated the director, but he doubted the paperwork would hold up in the harsh light of a Monday morning. He was coming for the keys, As Sheriff Boyd's cruiser rounded the final bend, he hit the brakes so hard the patrol car fishtailed in the gravel. "Sweet mother of mercy," Boyd muttered, his jaw dropping. Martha's property looked like a fortified military compound. The dying front lawn was completely covered in pup tents, sleeping bags, and heavy motorcycles. A massive bonfire was roaring in a rusted barrel in the driveway. And standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid, impenetrable human wall across the property line, were 500 Hell's Angels. Caldwell slammed on his brakes behind the cruiser, laying on the horn. He jumped out of his Mercedes, wearing an expensive trench coat and a furious scowl. "What is this, Sheriff?" Caldwell barked, pointing a manicured finger at the army of bikers. "Arrest them! They are trespassing on bank property. This house belongs to First Nevada Mutual as of 8 o'clock. Sheriff Boyd stepped out of his cruiser, resting his hand casually on his duty belt. He looked at the 500 hardened outlaws, then looked back at the banker. "Mr. Caldwell," Sheriff Boyd said slowly, "I have 1 pair of handcuffs and 6 bullets. I am not arresting a small army over a real estate dispute. You want to evict her? You walk up there and ask them to move." Caldwell sneered, adjusting his tie. "Fine, I will." The banker marched aggressively toward the property line. As he closed within 20 feet, Big Joe Callan and Wrench stepped out from the human wall. The sheer size of the 2 men caused Caldwell to instinctively slow his pace. "This property is in foreclosure," Caldwell shouted, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "You men need to vacate the premises immediately, or I am pressing federal charges for organized intimidation." From the porch, the front door opened. Martha stepped out, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She looked well-rested for the first time in nearly a year. Walking right beside her, holding a stack of legally bound papers, was Richard Harrison. Richard walked down the porch steps, past Wrench and Joe, and met the banker at the property line. He shoved the paperwork directly into Caldwell's chest. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Richard said, his tone dripping with professional venom. "I am Richard Harrison, Esquire. You'll find the cashier's checks clearing the total balance of the mortgage, signed and authorized by your regional director at 2:30 a.m. yesterday. You'll also find the recorded quitclaim deed, filed electronically with the county clerk at 7 a.m. today. First Nevada Mutual has absolutely zero legal claim to this land, this house, or this woman." Caldwell scrambled to read the documents. His eyes darted across the signatures, the bank seals, and the zeroed-out balances. He looked up, his face flushing crimson. This is highly irregular," Caldwell sputtered. "You forced this transaction under duress." At that exact moment, Big Joe Callan didn't say a word. He simply raised his right hand. In perfect unison, 500 bikers reached down and turned the ignitions on their Harleys. The simultaneous roar of 500 heavy V-twin engines starting at once was deafening. The ground literally shook beneath Caldwell's expensive Italian leather shoes. The sound was a physical force, a tidal wave of mechanical fury and sheer intimidation. Caldwell dropped the folder in the dirt. He turned on his heel, sprinted back to his silver Mercedes, threw it into reverse, and sped off down the country road, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Sheriff Boyd, watching the entire spectacle from the safety of his cruiser, simply chuckled. He tipped his hat to Martha, gave a 2-finger salute to Big Joe Callan, and drove away. The engines cut off, and silence returned to the farm. Martha, the sheriff's boot, kicked the door. Behind him, a bulldozer idled, ready to crush a blind, 72-year-old man's only sanctuary. The corrupt developer smirked, thinking he'd won. But then the pavement began to tremble. A deafening roar swallowed the sirens. The devil's cavalry was coming, and hell followed with them. For Henry Sterling, the world was not made of light and shadow, but of textures, temperatures, and sounds. He was 72 years old and had been entirely blind for the last 14 years, the result of a severe chemical accident during his 3 decades at a commercial solvent plant. His home, a modest, single-story ranch house on the dusty outskirts of San Bernardino, California, was his entire universe. He knew exactly how many paces it took to get from the worn armchair in the living room to the humming refrigerator. He knew the creak of the 3rd floorboard in the hallway, and he knew the smell of the massive, century-old oak tree that shaded his front porch. This house was more than just a roof over his head. It was a museum of his life. It was where his late wife, Martha, had baked her infamous pecan pies. It was where his only son, Tommy, had grown up. The walls held the echoes of a family that was now gone, leaving Henry as the sole guardian of their memory. But the world outside Henry's tactile sanctuary was changing, and it was changing ruthlessly. San Bernardino was sprawling, and the land Henry's house sat on had suddenly become extremely valuable. It was the geographic linchpin for a proposed multi-million-dollar luxury commercial complex, a sprawling monstrosity of high-end boutiques, artisan coffee shops, and luxury condominiums designed to price out the working-class locals. The man spearheading this project was Richard Caldwell. Caldwell was a man who wore $4,000 bespoke suits and possessed a smile that never quite reached his cold, predatory eyes. As the CEO of Vanguard Development, Caldwell made a very lucrative living by identifying vulnerable neighborhoods, bullying the residents into selling for pennies on the dollar, and bulldozing their lives into the dirt. He was a master of the legal squeeze. One by one, Henry's neighbors had folded. Some were bought out with flashy low-ball cash offers they couldn't refuse. Others were harassed out by Vanguard's aggressive lawyers who weaponized building codes and noise complaints until the residents simply gave up. Within a year, the entire street was empty, boarded up, and waiting for the wrecking ball. All except for Henry, for Henry refused to sell. When Caldwell's slick, fast-talking representatives showed up on Henry's porch, pushing a contract and a pen into his hands, Henry had simply handed them back, his clouded eyes staring straight through them. "This house isn't for sale," he had said, his voice gravelly but firm. "My wife's ghost lives in these walls. You don't have enough money to buy her out." Caldwell didn't handle rejection well. To him, Henry wasn't a human being. He was a stubborn, decaying obstacle, standing in the way of a $50 million payday. If Henry wouldn't be bought, Caldwell decided he would be broken. The developer turned to the dark, labyrinthine world of municipal loopholes. Caldwell had deep pockets and deep connections within the city council. Using a notoriously corrupt private inspector, Caldwell had Henry's property cited for dozens of fabricated blight and structural hazard violations. The fines piled up, thousands of dollars that Henry, living on a meager disability pension, could never hope to pay. Then came the kill shot. Because the fines went unpaid, the city placed a lien on the property. Through a shell company, Caldwell purchased the debt. Legally, the Vanguard CEO now held the keys to Henry's destruction. He fast-tracked a foreclosure and eviction notice through a sympathetic local judge. The legal machinery moved with terrifying, orchestrated speed. Henry never saw the eviction notice, of course. He only heard the sharp, aggressive knock of Deputy Hodges, a local cop who moonlighted as private security for Vanguard, and felt the cold, stiff paper being slapped into his hand. "You've got 48 hours, old man," Hodges had sneered, leaning in close so Henry could smell the stale coffee and chewing tobacco on his breath. "Friday morning at 8 a.m., the dozers are rolling in. If you're not out, we're dragging you out. Caldwell wants this lot leveled before lunch." Henry stood on his porch long after the cruiser's tires crunched away down the gravel road. The paper in his hand felt as heavy as an anvil. He was completely alone. He had no money for a lawyer. Legal aid had told him the process was too far along. The paperwork was airtight. Caldwell had outmaneuvered him flawlessly. That night, Henry sat in his armchair, listening to the silence of his home. The clock ticked on the mantelpiece. He ran his calloused fingers over the upholstery, tracing the familiar wear and tear. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his chest. Where would he go? A state-run facility? A cot in a sterile room where he didn't know the sounds, the smells, the distance to the door. The thought of the bulldozers tearing into Martha's kitchen, ripping down the height marks penciled onto the door frame where Tommy had grown. It was a violation he couldn't bear. He needed a miracle. But miracles didn't visit this part of San Bernardino. As the clock struck midnight, ticking down his final 32 hours, Henry pushed himself out of his chair. He navigated the dark hallway, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floorboards, until he reached the spare bedroom at the back of the house. Tommy's room. Henry hadn't changed a thing in there since his son had died 12 years ago. He opened the closet door. The smell of old leather, motor oil, and stale tobacco wafted out, hitting Henry like a physical blow. He reached in, his trembling hands brushing past denim jackets until they found what he was looking for. A heavy, thick leather vest. Tommy Sterling hadn't been a businessman, a lawyer, or a saint. He had been a full-patched member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, San Bernardino Charter. In fact, Tommy had been the sergeant-at-arms, a man deeply respected and fiercely feared. He had died exactly as he lived, violently and loyally. 12 years ago, during a massive orchestrated ambush by a rival cartel on a desert highway, Tommy had stayed behind, laying down suppressing fire so that the club's president and 5 younger prospects could escape. Tommy took 4 bullets to the chest, bleeding out on the asphalt, but he saved his brothers. In the outlaw biker world, blood is currency and loyalty is a religion. Henry ran his fingers over the heavy embroidery on the back of the vest. He traced the winged death head. He remembered the day of Tommy's funeral. Hundreds of bikers had shown up, a sea of leather and roaring chrome that had paralyzed the city. Before they left, a mountain of a man named Big Jim Lawson, the man whose life Tommy had saved, had pressed a small, heavy piece of cardstock into Henry's blind hand. "Your boy died for us, Mr. Sterling." Jim's deep, rumbling voice echoed in Henry's memory. "That means your club now, your family. If anybody ever crosses you, if you ever need anything, you call this number. Day or night, heaven or hell." Henry had tucked the card into the inner breast pocket of Tommy's vest, thinking he would never use it. He was a quiet, law-abiding man. He didn't want anything to do with outlaw bikers. But standing in the dark, with Vanguard's bulldozers looming on the horizon, Henry realized he was no longer fighting the law. The law had been bought. He was fighting a predator. And to fight a predator, you needed a monster. Henry fished the card out of the pocket. He went to his kitchen wall phone, carefully dialing the numbers from memory. He had traced the embossed digits on the card so many times over the years they were burned into his mind. The phone rang twice. Yeah, a rough, sleep-heavy voice answered. Is this Jim Lawson? Henry asked, his voice shaking slightly. The line went dead silent for a microsecond. The shift in the atmosphere on the other end of the phone was palpable. Who is this? This is Henry Sterling, Tommy's dad. Another pause. When Jim Lawson spoke again, the sleep was entirely gone from his voice. It was replaced by a sharp, lethal focus. Pop, are you okay? What's wrong? They're taking the house, Jim, Henry whispered, a single tear escaping his blind eyes, carving a hot path down his weathered cheek. A developer named Caldwell. He bought the city. They're coming with bulldozers tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I have nowhere to go. Henry heard the sound of a heavy chair scraping against a floorboards on the other end, followed by the muffled sound of Jim shouting to someone in the background. Wake the charter up! Now! Pop, listen to me. Jim's voice returned to the receiver, low and absolute. You stay in that house. You lock the doors. You make yourself a pot of coffee and you wait. Do you understand me? Jim, there are police involved. Hodges, the deputy. I don't give a damn if it's the National Guard, Jim growled. Nobody touches Tommy's house. Hold the line, Pop. We're coming. The line clicked dead. Thursday passed in an agonizing blur of anticipation. Henry packed nothing. If he was going down, he was going down with the ship. Friday morning arrived with the biting chill of a California winter. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Henry, sitting in his armchair, heard the heavy, grinding treads of a Caterpillar D9 bulldozer rolling down his street. He heard the screech of air brakes as a flatbed truck parked out front. Then came the slamming of car doors. Outside, Richard Caldwell stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at the modest, peeling house with profound disgust. Flanking him was Deputy Hodges and 4 private security contractors wearing tactical vests. Behind them, the massive yellow bulldozer idled, expelling thick plumes of black diesel smoke. All right, Hodges. Caldwell checked his Rolex. Let's get this fossil out of here. Drag him out by his ankles if you have to. I want the roof caved in by 8:15. Hodges unclipped his baton, walking up the driveway with a predatory swagger. He pounded his fist against Henry's front door. Sterling, time's up. Open the door, or I'm kicking it off the hinges. Inside, Henry gripped his cane. He didn't move. He closed his eyes, bracing for the splintering of wood. Hodges took a step back, raising his heavy boot to kick the door. But his foot never connected. It started as a vibration, a low, rhythmic tremor that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the earth. Caldwell paused, looking down at his polished leather shoes. The loose gravel in Henry's driveway began to dance and skip. Then came the sound. It wasn't the sound of traffic. It was a guttural, mechanical roar, deep and terrifying, swelling over the horizon like a metallic tsunami. The air itself began to vibrate. The bulldozer's engine noise was entirely drowned out. What the hell is that? Hodges muttered, lowering his leg, his hand instinctively dropping to his holstered firearm. Caldwell turned around, looking down the long, 2-lane road that led to Henry's neighborhood. His breath caught in his throat. The color drained completely from his arrogant face. Coming over the crest of the hill, blocking out the morning sun, was a wall of chrome, black leather, and glaring headlights. It wasn't 10 motorcycles. It wasn't 50. It was a legion. Thousands of Hell's Angels, riding 2 abreast in a column that stretched back as far as the eye could see. The thunder of 3,000 V-twin engines hit the Vanguard crew like a physical shockwave. Jim Lawson hadn't just called the San Bernardino charter. He had invoked a club-wide emergency. He had called Oakland. He had called Los Angeles. He had called charters from Nevada and Arizona. They had ridden through the night, a massive, unified army, converging on one point for one man. Henry sat in his living room, feeling the shockwaves rattle his teacups in the cupboards. He couldn't see the army that was descending upon his street, but he could feel them. The sheer, overwhelming power vibrating through the floorboards traveled up his cane and into his hands. A slow, defiant smile spread across the blind man's face. Tommy's brothers had arrived. The procession was not just a show of force. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The roaring river of motorcycles poured down the two-lane street, a relentless, deafening tide of heavy American steel. The ground shook so violently that the windows of Caldwell's Mercedes began to rattle in their frames. The air, previously thick with the acrid smoke of the bulldozer, was instantly replaced by the raw, intoxicating scent of high-octane fuel, burning rubber, and hot engine oil. Caldwell stood frozen, his bespoke suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. He watched in absolute paralyzing horror as the bikers arrived. They did not shout. They did not brandish weapons. They simply maneuvered with terrifying, military-like precision. The lead rider, a colossal man sitting astride a custom, matte black Harley-Davidson road glide, signaled with a raised, gloved fist. Immediately, the column split. Hundreds of bikers peeled off to the left, and hundreds more to the right. They drove their heavy machines directly over the curb, tearing through the overgrown weeds and completely encircling Henry's property line. They parked tire to tire, an unbroken, impenetrable fence of metal and muscle. Behind them, the street completely disappeared under a sea of leather. The bikers turned off their engines in rolling waves. As the deafening roar of the exhausts died down, it was replaced by something far more intimidating: the simultaneous, heavy click of 3,000 kickstands hitting the asphalt. Then came the silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. 3,000 men crossed their arms. 3,000 pairs of eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, fixed in a dead stare on Richard Caldwell, Deputy Hodges, and the 4 trembling private security contractors. Deputy Hodges, whose bravado had completely evaporated, instinctively reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Hodges," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I need backup at the Sterling residence. Immediate backup. We have a massive 1031 situation. I'm surrounded by thousands of—" "Hodges, this is dispatch," the radio crackled back, the operator sounding absolutely terrified. The chief ordered a strict stand-down. State police have blocked the highway exits to prevent more from entering the county. We are not, repeat, we are not, sending patrol cars into a Hells Angels club-wide mobilization. You are on your own. Do not provoke them. Acknowledge?" Hodges dropped the radio. It clattered against the driveway. The massive man on the lead. Harley slowly swung his heavy boots over his seat and stepped off. This was Big Jim Lawson, president of the San Bernardino Charter. He stood 6'5", his leather cut adorned with the winged death head, the president rocker on his chest, and a bottom rocker that simply read, San Bernardino. Jim didn't look at Caldwell. He didn't look at the armed contractors. He walked straight past them, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped at the base of Henry's porch steps. Inside the house, Henry could feel the profound shift in the atmosphere. The violent shaking of the earth had stopped, replaced by an eerie, electric tension. He gripped his cane, pushed the front door open, and stepped out onto the porch. The crisp morning air hit his face, but he wasn't cold. "Henry?" A deep, rumbling voice spoke from the bottom of the steps. Henry's clouded eyes widened. A smile, fragile but immensely relieved, broke across his weathered face. "Jim, is that you, son?" "It's me, Pop," Jim said, his massive hand reaching up to gently grip Henry's trembling shoulder. "I brought a few of Tommy's brothers with me. Hope you don't mind the noise." "I've never heard a more beautiful sound in my entire life," Henry whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Caldwell, finally finding a shred of his corporate arrogance, stepped forward. His face was flushed crimson with rage and terror. "Now you listen to me!" Caldwell shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at Jim. "I don't care what kind of motorcycle gang you are. I have a legal right to this land. I own the debt. I have a court-ordered eviction notice, and if you don't clear out right now, I will have every single one of you arrested for federal trespassing." Big Jim slowly turned around. He looked down at Caldwell with the kind of expression a man might reserve for a cockroach on his kitchen floor. "You don't own a damn thing, Suit," Jim rumbled, his voice low enough to make the hairs on the back of Hodges's neck stand up. "I have the paperwork right here," Caldwell yelled, waving a manila folder in the air. "The law is on my side. The bulldozer is pushing this house into the dirt today." At the mention of the bulldozer, Jim casually glanced over Caldwell's shoulder at the massive yellow machine. Sitting in the operator's cab was a man named Danny, a Vanguard contractor. Danny looked out the window, realizing that he was currently the only man sitting above a crowd of 3,000 heavily patched, extremely angry outlaw bikers. Jim didn't say a word. He simply stared at Danny and gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the street. Danny swallowed hard. He reached up, killed the engine of the bulldozer, threw his hard hat onto the passenger seat, climbed out of the cab and sprinted down the street, pushing his way through the wall of bikers to escape. "Get back here, you coward!" Caldwell screamed, his voice pitching into hysteria. He turned back to Hodges. "Arrest them! Arrest him right now!" Hodges took 2 steps backward, his hands held up in surrender. "I'm not dying for your strip mall, Richard. I'm out. You think you can just bully me?" Caldwell spat, breathing heavily, trying to maintain his ground. "You think intimidation changes the law? The city placed a lien of $34,000 on this property. Unpaid blight citations. Vanguard Development bought that lien. The foreclosure is signed by a judge. This is a legally executed eviction. You can stand here all day, but Henry Sterling no longer owns this house." "You're right about one thing, Mr. Caldwell," a smooth, cultured voice echoed from the front line of bikers. The wall of leather parted. Out stepped a man who looked like an absolute contradiction. He wore the heavy leather cut of a full-patched Hell's Angel, but underneath it, he was wearing a pristine, charcoal-grey, tailored 3-piece suit. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase. This was Wyatt Miller. In the biker world, he was known as the Shark. He was a graduate of Stanford Law, a ruthless corporate litigator, and the club's top legal counsel. Wyatt walked up the driveway, adjusted his silk tie beneath his club patches, and popped the latches on his briefcase. "We are well aware of the municipal lien placed on Mr. Sterling's property," Wyatt said, his tone dripping with professional condescension. "In fact, we spent all night doing a deep forensic audit of Vanguard Development's municipal dealings. It's amazing what a team of paralegals can find when they are highly motivated." Caldwell blinked, thoroughly thrown off balance. "What are you talking about?" Wyatt pulled out a thick stack of documents. "I'm talking about the fact that Vanguard Development utilized a shell company, Apex Holdings, to buy Mr. Sterling's debt. A shell company that, according to these bank records, has been funneling illegal kickbacks to a city building inspector named Gary Higgins to falsify blight reports on targeted properties. Caldwell's face went from crimson to a ghostly, sickly pale. That is slander. Those are fabricated lies. Oh, Gary didn't think so. Wyatt smiled thinly. When a dozen of my associates knocked on Gary's door at 3 o'clock this morning to kindly ask him about these signatures, he was incredibly cooperative. In fact, he was so cooperative, he signed a sworn affidavit confessing to the extortion racket. An affidavit that we emailed to the district attorney, the FBI field office in Los Angeles, and the California Attorney General exactly 20 minutes ago. Hodges, hearing the word FBI, immediately unclipped his deputy badge from his belt, dropped it directly into the dirt, and briskly walked away down the street, disappearing into the crowd. However, Wyatt continued, raising a finger to silence Caldwell's sputtering protests, the lien itself, despite being fraudulently obtained, is currently still on the county ledgers, and as a law-abiding motorcycle club, we respect the ledger. Wyatt turned and nodded to two massive bikers standing near Jim Lawson. They walked forward, carrying heavy black canvas duffel bags. They unzipped the bags, turned them upside down, and shook them. Cascades of cash, $100 bills, 50s, 20s, crumpled 10s and dirty 5s, spilled out onto the dirt at Caldwell's expensive Italian leather shoes. It was a chaotic mountain of paper. $34,218, Wyatt announced loudly. The exact amount of the debt, paid in full, in cash, on behalf of Henry Sterling. We crowdsourced it from the Brotherhood. As of exactly 8:01 a.m., the debt is satisfied. The foreclosure is legally null and void. The eviction is cancelled. Caldwell stared at the pile of money, his jaw trembling. His multi-million-dollar project, his reputation, his entire hour was unraveling in the span of 5 minutes on a dusty driveway. "You think this stops me?" Caldwell hissed, a desperate, cornered animal. "I own the 40 acres behind this house. I'll build right around him. I'll box him in. I'll build a loading dock right against his bedroom window. I'll make his life a living hell." Wyatt actually laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "You really should check your emails, Richard." Wyatt pulled one final piece of paper from his briefcase. It was a land deed. You see, Vanguard Development had an option to buy those 40 acres from the city. But you never finalized the escrow because you were waiting to bulldoze Henry's lot first to save on grading costs. Huge mistake. Because at 6 a.m. today, when the county clerk's office opened, a private religious organization swooped in and purchased those 40 acres for cash at 20% above market value. Caldwell's eyes widened in horror. What private religious organization? Big Jim Lawson stepped forward, towering over the broken developer. He flashed a wicked, terrifying grin, his gold tooth catching the morning sun. "The Church of the Hells Angels, San Bernardino Charter," Jim rumbled. "We've been looking for a place to build our new West Coast mega clubhouse. Gonna have a massive garage, an outdoor concert stage, and a shooting range right about where you wanted to put your artisanal coffee shop. We figure Henry here won't mind the noise." Caldwell was entirely defeated. His knees buckled slightly. He looked at the mountain of cash, then up at the unbroken wall of thousands of bikers who were now smirking, chuckling, and revving their engines in a unified chorus of mockery. He had tried to crush a helpless old man, and in doing so, he had summoned the very devil himself. Caldwell turned, stumbled to his Mercedes, and got in. He backed out of the driveway so fast he nearly tore the bumper off, fleeing down the street as the massive crowd of bikers parted just enough to let him escape in absolute disgrace. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Bikers cheered, raising their fists into the air. On the porch, Henry Sterling stood entirely still, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. He felt Big Jim's arm wrap around his shoulders again. "They're gone, Pop," Jim said softly, his deep voice carrying over the cheers of his brothers. "The land is ours. The house is yours. And it's gonna stay yours until the end of time." Henry reached up, his trembling fingers finding the heavy leather of Jim's vest, feeling the embroidered letters of the club that had just saved his life. He couldn't see the army of chrome and steel that filled his neighborhood, but in his mind's eye, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. "Thank you," Henry whispered, tears freely falling down his cheeks. "Tommy would be so proud." Jim smiled, looking out over the sea of his brothers. "Tommy saved us, Henry. It was our turn to save you. Now how about we head inside? 3,000 of us out here, and I think we could all use a cup of Martha's famous coffee." Henry laughed, a bright, joyous sound that echoed through the century-old oak tree in his front yard. For the first time in 14 years, the blind man was no longer in the dark. He was surrounded by family. If this story of ultimate loyalty and brotherhood made your blood pump, smash that like button. Hit subscribe to join our channel for more incredible, true-to-life stories where the underdogs win and bullies get exactly what they deserve. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear that family isn't just blood. It's who shows up when you need them most. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think of the bikers' brilliant revenge.